This meeting is being recorded.
Welcome everyone to the 9th session of our monthly public lecture of the ISS focal topic Justice and Sustainability, which this month quite suitingly happens to occur just a few days after this year's global climate strike. My name is Alexandra Toast and I am a research associate in the focal topic coordination team here at the ISS, and I will moderate today's session. I'm very excited to welcome our guest, Professor Frank Biermann, who will talk about solar geoengineering as a false climate policy solution. Before we start the lecture, I would like to briefly introduce our focal topic. This year, for the first time, the ISS has defined an overall focal topic. The goal is to deepen our understanding of the nexus between justice concerns and sustainability. It is common to evaluate justice concerns such as matters related to the just transformations in the dimensions of distributional, procedural, and recognitional justice, but we are also keen to address topics beyond these categories. So how does today's guest and presentation relate to this? On the one hand, Professor Frank Biermann for sure will help us understand the complex issues related to solar geoengineering. And on the other hand, he himself has taken a role that is becoming more and more common in justice and sustainability matters. He, apart from being a scholar, also became an activist when he led in 2021 the launch of a new initiative for an international non-use agreement on solar geoengineering. After Professor Biermann's lecture, we will hear a comment on it by our colleague, Dr. Gabriel Dort from the ISS research group, Planetary Geopolitics and Geoengineering. And then we will open up for a discussion with the audience. We are very delighted that Gabriel stepped in for his research group leader, Dr. Stefan Schäfer, who was announced, but unfortunately needed to cancel his participation on short notice. And now Professor Louis Coetzee, the interim lead of the focal topic team, will introduce Professor Biermann. So please go ahead, Louis.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this talk. I'm extremely excited and also honored to introduce to you Professor Frank Biermann, who is very well known, of course. I suspect also to most of the participants here, so I won't spend too much time on his very extensive CV. But Frank is a research professor of global sustainability governance at the Copernicus Institute of Sustainable Development at Utrecht University in the Netherlands. Frank is a leading international scholar of global institutions and organizations in the sustainability domain. He is extremely widely cited. Almost 21,000 citations, which is absolutely remarkable, certainly for someone in the social sciences. And he works on international organizations, multilateral regimes, climate refugees, the SDGs, politics of science, global justice, and now also increasingly on the issue of solar geoengineering. Frank has several remarkable points of achievement throughout his career. Certainly one is the fact that he pioneered the Earth system governance paradigm in global change research in 2005. And he was also the founder and it's the first chair of this research network, which is currently today the largest social science network focusing specifically on Earth system governance challenges and research. He currently directs a 2.5 million euro research program under an ERC grant, specifically focused on the Sustainable Development Goals. Very recently, a paper just appeared in Nature Sustainability, looking at the political impacts of the SDGs. Apart from that, Frank has authored and edited 18 books. He's published over 200 articles and almost 100 policy contributions. It's quite remarkable. He is also the editor-in-chief of the peer-reviewed open access journal Earth System Governance with Elsevier, and the co-editor of several book series, including, among others, the Earth System Governance series with MIT Press. And he has won numerous scholarships and awards, the most recent being in 2021, the Distinguished Scholar Award in Environmental Studies by the International Studies Association. I'm absolutely delighted and grateful to count Frank as one of my long-time colleagues and friends. And I want to thank him also for taking the time to speak to us today on an increasingly important and certainly also controversial topic of solar geoengineering. And Frank is currently leading a large global initiative specifically focusing and researching and substantiating claims for a non-use agreement in solar geoengineering. Frank, thank you very much for joining us. We are delighted to have you here and to listen to you talk to us about this extremely important topic. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Louis, very much for this very kind introduction. I must also say that in 2017, I have been a visiting scholar at the ISS, and I really enjoyed this time tremendously. So I'm very happy that I'm virtually now back in Potsdam at the Institute and that I'm invited and looking forward to discussions with you all about issues of geoengineering. Which are, and this is also the topic of this series, which are, I think, inherently related to issues of justice, global justice, local justice, climate justice in the broader sense. So this is what I want to introduce in about 40 minutes, and then I'm looking forward to the discussion. Let me just start to introduce the topic on 2 slides. If you look at the right graph, you see a slide from a so-called commission. It's called the Climate Overshoot Commission that tries to sketch a future scenario of climate policy, where you see the green line, which is the emissions reductions. This is where we are kind of today. Adaptation is the blue part. But then these scholars of the Climate Overshoot Commission, they're envisioning, in addition, 2 other parts of climate policy as potential hypothetical, speculative elements in the future climate policy. And the one is carbon dioxide removal, and the other one is sunlight reflection methods, also called solar radiation management or solar geoengineering. So these 2 new ideas are being entered into the debate on climate policy. And I believe that both of them are, in a sense, elements of what I call climate obstruction. They're supported by claims that the green part, the emission reductions, would be too expensive, they would be unfeasible, unrealistic, or maybe too late, and that therefore we would have now to complement this climate policy portfolio by these 2 additional measures, or at least consider these 2 additional measures, carbon dioxide removal and sunlight reflection method. And both of them together are quite often called geoengineering. But they are quite different. So I talk on one slide about the first, what I call geoengineering type 1, which is the idea to remove carbon from the atmosphere. And there are lots of different possibilities that are being discussed in the scientific literature, also in the policy debate, also in the IPCC. They range from plant-based approaches, just simple afforestation, down to bioenergy with carbon sequestration, and then eventual also then industrial processes that would suck artificially the carbon out of the air and store it underground. There are lots of these proposals. All of them would be huge in scale to have any effect. So you can't have it with a few factories or a few trees. You really have huge implementation programs, deployment programs for these technologies to really have an impact on climate. All of these proposals have implications on climate justice, especially all those that require land, where land prices might increase, and these programs might enter into a competition with poor and vulnerable communities for land, arable land that can be used, also has to be used for food and food security. And all of this was originally called geoengineering, but increasingly it's no longer being called geoengineering. So it's kind of a diversion that this particular discussion on carbon dioxide removal went into one direction. And most people who are talking about geoengineering today are talking about a second type that has originally been called and is still called geoengineering. And that is a totally different idea. And this idea would mean that we would try by certain means to block a part of the incoming sunlight and therefore cool the planet artificially. There are lots of terms that are being used for this particular technology or set of technologies. People call it solar radiation management, solar radiation modification, solar geoengineering, and there are also a range of new terms that are also being used today increasingly, such as climate alteration, climate intervention, or even novel climate protection technologies. So all of these terms essentially mean the same. They mean that we try to identify and develop and potentially at some point also to deploy certain techniques to reflect a part of the incoming sunlight and therefore to cool the planet. The most widely discussed technology right now is the idea of injecting aerosols in the stratosphere around 20 kilometers above the air, and to use this and to temporarily cool the planet. So it's clear that these injections of aerosols would not stay in the stratosphere forever. After some time, a year or so, they would kind of fall down to the Earth and the cooling effect would be over. So therefore, these technologies would have to be implanted for a long time if the cooling effect were to be continued. There are some proponents who argue that this is a line of technologies that need to be researched and potentially also to develop. The argument is, one important argument is that we might need this as a temporary measure in the 21st century to shave the peak emissions. So in the sense that we would continue our programs of decarbonization, but maybe we would not succeed to limit the global warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees. And at that particular moment of time, we would use solar geoengineering to shave off the peak of the emissions for 1 or 2 generations, depending on how it goes. We would buy time. The question is, of course, we would buy time for whom? And the second idea related to the first one is that we might need these technologies at some point, or future generations might need these technologies at some point. If something goes wrong, if we do not achieve decarbonization at all, and if our climate policies, for whatever reason, would fail, or there might be surprises in the system. So therefore, we would need to have this tool of solar geoengineering in our toolbox, and some future moment in 2050 or so, if anything goes wrong in our current climate policy. It's kind of like a fail-safe, it's like an insurance idea. And all of these proponents argue that right now there's so much uncertainty around solar geoengineering that now we would start researching these kind of technologies to better understand whether they would work and what their impacts would be, and to have them available as a future option. So do researching it and also slowly developing these sets of technologies. And this led over time to what I would call a creeping normalization of solar geoengineering. The National Academy of Science in the United States has published a report last year in which they argued or called for a federal research program of a certain size, and to research in the United States, maybe also in collaboration with other countries, to research solar geoengineering and its potential impacts and effectiveness. Nature has published an article, which you see on the right side, an editorial of Nature actually, in which they argued that that research into solar geoengineering should be given a chance. And there was actually also a field experiment planned over indigenous territory in Sweden, where researchers from Harvard universities tried a very, very small experiment that would lead to the further development of solar geoengineering technologies. And this particular experiment has met tremendous resistance in Sweden and internationally, and essentially, eventually, the Harvard researchers had to stop the experiment, and it has been postponed for a later point of time. So this is a context, especially in the last 1 or 2 years, that lead to a normalization, or actors are trying to normalize solar geoengineering as a standard, as a normal tool or normal element of future climate policy in the 21st century. And for me, this is highly problematic. And I see 3 main problems, and I have a few slides on each of these problems. The first is the standard problem that the science is extremely uncertain when it comes to solar geoengineering. Number 1 is the risk and the effectiveness of solar geoengineering is poorly understood. And this is what everybody agrees. Also, the proponents agree that we know very little about whether solar geoengineering would work and what its impacts would be, and also what the harm would be or could be if these technologies would ever be deployed. What is also, I think, pretty understood by everybody and agreed by everybody is that the impacts are likely to vary across world regions. There might be parts of the planet that have a higher impact, a negative impact of solar geoengineering if it would ever be deployed. And the risks are unevenly spread. And these technologies might, if something goes wrong, depending also on the type of deployment, They might change or affect negatively the regional weather patterns in certain parts of the globe. They might affect agriculture and therefore also the provision of food and water, especially for the most vulnerable people who might be especially affected by any negative impacts from solar geoengineering. From the political perspective, I'm a political scientist, as Louis has pointed out. From a political perspective, it's three things are pretty clear. Number one is the type of technology that is being discussed, the solar geoengineering, the injection of aerosols in the stratosphere. It could be deployed by only very few countries. Technically, one country alone, even non-state actors, could use the technology in trying to attempt to change the climate without approval and consensus and cooperation with all other countries. Technically, this would be possible. One country alone could do it. Number two, it's also pretty clear from the first calculations that are being provided by the proponents of these technologies that solar engineering could be relatively cheap. People talk about $10 billion per year. It sounds like a lot of money, but compared to all the other sums of money that might be needed for mitigation, adaptation, it's relatively cheap in the calculation that are currently being provided. And it's also clear that solar engineering planetary scale is always risky. That's also clear. That there is no way really to fully minimize the risk. There will always be a risk that comes with each technology, and this risk might be different for different people in different places. However, I believe and argue also, and I will continue to argue also in this presentation, that more research is not the solution here. Continuing the discussion about scientific uncertainty, the inherent problem of solar geoengineering is that the final proof whether it works and what its impacts will be can only be given after it has been tried out at planetary scale. So in a sense, what we have is a scientific project which is calculating and modeling the planet as it is being seen by climate scientists and modelers. And this is where modelers and climate scientists would try out solar geoengineering. And then we have the real world. And we know, of course, that science is not necessarily able to fully understand all natural processes on planet Earth. So in a sense, what we would face is a planetary experiment where scientists would lead a solar geoengineering program at global scale, planetary scale. And we all, 8 billion people, we would have to sit at home and we would have to wait and to pray that the scientific calculations are correct and that there are not some unknown elements in this Earth system that we have overlooked that might turn out differently and that might lead to major negative impacts that come with these technologies. So I like to compare this with this movie that many of you have seen, Don't Look Up. And I compared with this kind of movie where we would eventually have to be sitting there in our dining rooms. We would have to look up and we would have to hope that the scientists got it right. And this leads me to the second problem, also related to this movie in a way, which was a movie about the destruction of an asteroid, a comet flying to Earth and threatening to destroy the planet. The question of governance. And I think this is one of the key problems that come with solar engineering. It is just implausible or even impossible to design or to imagine a just system of global governance to deal with this kind of technology. What you need is, so if you really would go forward, you wanted to go forward with a program on solar geoengineering at planetary scale around 2040, 2050, that would involve maybe 100 or maybe 1,000 airplanes flying around the planet on a daily basis, injection sulfur or something else into the stratosphere. To do that, you would need to have a global agreement, or you would need to have a plan, an agreement on the intensity of the deployment. That is, I mean, how cool do you actually want to get the planet? Do you want to reduce it by 0.5 degree, 1 degree? I mean, what is actually the target value that you are aiming at when you deploy the technologies? How would you like to deploy the technologies? Where would you do it? And what kind of way you would do it? And all this has different impacts on the potential risk with these technologies. The duration of deployment, so after 1 or 2 years, the impact might be gone. And therefore the discussion is, I mean, do you continue this for another 10 years, another 20 years, another 30 years? And it depends a lot on also the process in climate policy and also the responsibility and compensation for any harm that may be caused. There must be also agreements on that. So what happens if something goes wrong? What are the securities for those who are negatively affected? Will anybody compensate them for any harm? And we know from the current climate discussions that the compensation and the liability part is so far not accepted whatsoever by the industrialized countries. So the hypothesis or the question would be whether these countries would ever accept any responsibility and any compensation duties for harm that may be caused by the negative impacts from solar geoengineering. So justice becomes, and this is the topic of the series, very important also here, because the risk would be unevenly spread between especially the global north and the global south. The global south would be probably most negatively affected by any harm related to the wealth, to the general situation in the global south, but also to some parts of the geography of these countries. The deployment, on the other hand, of these technologies would probably be possible only by rich countries that have the means and the technological skills to run a program of solar geoengineering at planetary scale. So this kind of very much a conflict, a potential conflict between the global north and the global south on this particular, on the question of deployment and how to deploy these kind of technologies. And therefore what we need is a decision-making procedure that involves all countries, that involves the global south and the global north, that all countries are meaningfully involved in decision makings on solar geoengineering at planetary scale. And the question is, how would we ever do that? So far, this is research I have done some years ago with Ina Möller. So far, the discourse on geoengineering is very much dominated by only very few countries. It's essentially an American discourse community. You see here, we counted the speakers at events on solar geoengineering. So we counted various workshops and other events where the majority of the speakers were United States and United Kingdom, and partially also Germany because of some past research programs here. But most other countries are just not present at these workshops. They're not involved in these debates. It is a debate driven by the United States together with a few other industrialized countries. So it is so far a very biased, it's a very unequal global discourse community. If you look at the global governance structure that is currently available, and that would have to deal with issues of solar geoengineering and deployment of solar geoengineering, we have the United Nations General Assembly, but here it's clear it lacks any enforcement power. Its decisions are not binding. It's certainly not the right body. It was developed in 1945. It's certainly not meant to deploy solar geoengineering at a planetary scale. And the same is the case for the UN Environment Programme that deals with a number of environment issues, but it's certainly lacking any mandate, but also the skills and the operational capacity to implement such a program. And the same is also true for the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. None of them is in a position to really take these decisions and run a global program on solar geoengineering. And if you look at decision making as such, all of these UN bodies, with very, very few exceptions, they follow the principle today of sovereign equality. And that means every country has one vote. You see it here on the slide, the General Assembly. It's very clear. Each member of the Assembly has one vote, and decisions on the more important issues, such as peace and security, require a 2/3 majority of the members, countries' members, that are present and voting. And this is how the UN has functioned since 1945. That means every country has one vote. And this is a standard procedure in all environmental treaties with very, very few exceptions. And that means essentially that the tiny countries have the majority. 5% of the global population are making up the majority of the votes in the General Assembly. You have here a couple of them like Monaco and Andorra and Liechtenstein, Luxembourg. All of these countries in the United Nations General Assembly and in any other international institution have the same vote as China, and they have the same vote as India and other larger countries. And this is surely a system that is not acceptable for large countries if it comes to the deployment of planetary scale solar geoengineering. There are some people who say, well, then we try to do it in a more democratic way, that we give every person the same voting right. And I could imagine like a global people's assembly where there's some democratic way of decision making where every person has the same say in the deployment of solar geoengineering programs at planetary scale. And that would lead essentially that India and China together, the people in India and the people in China together, would make up the majority. This is, you see here, some of the population, the largest populated countries. Germany is not even part of that. That means that these large countries would essentially dominate any decision when it comes to geoengineering, and this will, the share of the large, the global south countries will actually increase over time if you're looking forward to 2050, where these decisions would probably need to be taken. And let me just have a very concrete example in this situation. United States is a country where the scientific community is the most active and the most pushy to work towards a system of research and development and potentially deployment of solar engineering at some point. So the question is, what would the United States politically accept when it comes to the global governance of solar engineering? Would the United States accept a one country, one vote system like we have today in the General Assembly or in the Climate Convention? Then the United States would have one vote out of 194. If you would go for one person, one vote, as you have seen on the previous slide, the United States would have about 4% of the votes. So in all or most UN decision-making procedures, developing countries have a large majority, up to 70, 80%. So the question is, would the United States Senate, for example, or the Supreme Court, or a president of the United States ever accept such a political process by which the United States essentially have no say in the outcome of decisions, in a decision that would then affect also the United States when it comes to planetary scale solar engineering? So would the United States ever accept decisions that are essentially dominated by the global south? And if not, what then? Another option that has been discussed at some point is the United Nations Security Council, which has a stronger mandate than other UN agencies. It's normally involved and it's about issues about international peace and security, but you could believe that, or you could argue maybe that solar engineering would be such a situation. But the Security Council lacks essentially legitimacy because it is dominated by only 5 countries that have been powerful in 1945 when the council was set up. You see here Article 23, this is the original version from 1945, where it says that there are the Republic of China, France, Russia, United Kingdom, and the United States. They are permanent members of this council, and they have, each one of them has a veto power. So the United Kingdom and France individually have a veto power about any decision that comes from the Security Council of the United Nations. So the question is, would anybody from the rest of the world, the 74% of the world that don't have a veto power and that they're partially also not represented in the Security Council, would these countries accept solar engineering program at planetary scale by such a body? And my argument would be they would not. It would not be fair, it would not be legitimate, and it would not be accepted by all other countries. There are some people who say, well, the United Nations is a very complex, maybe even dysfunctional body, so therefore we would work differently. We would work with like-minded countries. So there are ideas that then the major powers alone would do it. But then the question is, which major powers would actually work together? If you read the newspaper and you see the variety of global conflicts you have, can you imagine that there are alliances of the major powers that are right now, I mean, the main point of discussion is right now the use of nuclear weapons, what you find in the newspapers. Do you think that these countries together would have an agreement that would be widely accepted globally to run a program on planetary climate interventions and cooling the planet artificially by the use of 1,000 airplanes on a daily basis? Is this really a plausible scenario? I would say no. There would be disagreements. What do we do with the disagreements? If countries disagree on the deployment, on the location of deployment, the degree of cooling, and all other issues that come with it, there are discussions about counter geoengineering. Sometimes you read these books and they say, well, one country could use cruise missiles to shoot down the airplanes of other countries. Not that this is Anyway, these are just horror scenarios that would come with a planetary deployment of solar engineering by some countries without the approval of all the other countries. And without any governance, it's just a mess. So without any global governance that can constrain and can guide the behavior of those countries that are able to do geoengineering, it will just be a big disaster. And it's very difficult to imagine, I mean, how this all would play out if some countries start geoengineering, other countries object. Most countries have nothing to say and they have no means of interfering anyway. And then something goes wrong, of course, and we don't already know what kind of policies would be pursued by those countries. It's a huge mess. Some people even go down the line and talk about the involvement of the billionaires of the world. So there's a discussion about the green finger, a rich billionaire who would kind of, him or herself, deal with these issues. This is, of course, I mean, it's not very likely that, I mean, these scenarios that Bill Gates would buy an island and then start these airplanes and launch them by himself. I mean, this is not likely, of course, because you need to have a sovereign territory to run these things. So I'm not concerned about unilateral deployment by a billionaire, but these huge philanthropic agencies, which are the foundations run by these people, could certainly be a major factor in tipping the balance. And they're certainly needed also in some way to be part of these programs. So if there would ever be a program on solar engineering, it's quite likely that the richest people in the world and the biggest corporations will have a major influence in the development of these technologies and potentially therefore also the control about these technologies. And this makes it also a highly risky, politically risky strategy to go into that direction. And that leads me already to my third problem, which I think is maybe the even most important. I believe solar engineering is not part of the solution, it will be part of a problem. And that is that solar engineering might help as a speculative hope. It might delay the decarbonization policies that we are right now observing in many countries. So we are now maybe at a tipping point, at a peak for coal, oil, and many others. There is a huge trend where countries are agreeing on net zero targets. So the climate policy takes up speed, I would argue. And I'm afraid that solar engineering will delay and derail these processes by offering a cheap hope that with $10 billion per year, you can buy yourself out of drastic emission reduction policies, and you can continue for another 10, 20, 30 years the use and of oil, of gas, of coal, and other greenhouse gas producing activities, because people could believe that in 2050 we might have this plan B of solar engineering, and that would lead to a lock-in of solar engineering, and that would lead into a delay and derailing of the current decarbonization policies. And I think this is a very, very big threat. It's a threat that you can observe with many environmental issue areas where industry first has denied the problem and later has used all kinds of tools to delay policies in order to minimize the negative financial impact on their policies, on their activities. And I believe, or I'm afraid, that solar engineering as a hypothetical, speculative technology that could be effective around 2050 will lead to a major delay. It will be a major breaking of the current processes of decarbonization policies around the world. I think the entire climate policy process will be mightily negatively affected, and this is the biggest threat that comes from these kind of debates. For example, I mean, this is one of the many articles you find these days about the sunken assets. I mean, that a lot of, and this is one article, for example, a recent one that argued that 60% of the oil and the fossil gas and 90% of the coal will need to remain in the ground if we want to meet the 1.5 targets. And this is oil, this is gas, this is a coal that many people own. This has an industry, has a financial value. So here it's also argued that oil and gas has to decline globally by 3%. And this is, for many, many corporations, bad news. So there's a threat that these kind of requirements of drastic emission reductions in pathway will lead to further resistance of the losing industry, so to speak, and that they eventually would pick up on solar engineering as the last hope, and that this would have the negative impacts and lock in these technologies for the rest of the century. There's one example that went through the internet quite vigorously the last summer for the CEO from Exxon, who argued very strongly for carbon capture and emissions and described it in one article actually as the holy grail. So the idea that you can continue with oil for some time, a bit more longer, as long as you capture the emissions and store them underground. So this is only about carbon removal. Mr. Woods has not said anything about solar engineering, but my fear is that 5 or 10 years down the line, it will be quite likely that industry and all kind of actors that go with it, including also countries, will embrace solar engineering as a last hope to keep their business model and to keep also their lifestyles for societies intact. So I think it's a major delay for climate policy. It's a major risk for us. So that solar engineering might end up what I sometimes call the final capitalist escape route to maintain the profits while cheaply fixing the climate problem by these speculative technologies of which we don't know whether they are effective in the first place. So in short, to summarize my talk so far, I think that solar engineering is not a solution. It's not a plan B. And number one is there's no scenario anywhere plausible that it could be governed globally in a just and effective manner. The only scenario would be a sort of a world government, which is not to be expected very soon, to put it mildly. So the only solution would be somehow a centralized authority that is accountable to all people in a just and democratic manner. And that is also powerful enough to constrain rogue deployment of these technologies. And this is not what I expect for the next generation to come. Instead of being a plan B, I believe that the development of solar engineering technologies today would delay and derail the much needed societal economic transformation that we have. I think it's not a safeguard, it's not somehow a security policy that we have if we have it ready. If we would have solar engineering technologies developed today, it will harm the process, emissions will not go down, mitigation policies will be delayed, and we will enter a totally new world in the Anthropocene with high concentrations or relatively high concentrations of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, and we would have to mask these high concentrations for quite some time by artificially cooling the planet by means of solar engineering. So we would lock in this technology for at least this century, and I think this is the future I do not want to leave to my children. And I believe also, and this is the discussion we always have about science, academic freedom. I believe in academic freedom, but I also believe that academic and science is not innocent. There is sometimes this idea that scientists say, well, I do not want to have my scientific invention used in that particular way. I'm in favor of mitigation. It's just an extra, it's just a plan B. But the point is, an individual scientist, an individual research group will never be able to control their findings. So once the thing is out, anybody can use it. Putin will get it, the Chinese government will get it. Donald Trump, if he would ever be re-elected, he would be in possession of these tools, etc., etc., etc. Anybody on this planet who can afford 100 or 1,000 airplanes, the technology will not be that difficult. The skills, the capacities will be widely spread, and scientists will not be able to control what they're doing. They will create something that might or will, maybe even most likely, be ending up in the hands of the wrong people who have different views and different interests and different values also as individual scientists who are now sitting there in the labs and trying to think about how could they develop these kind of technologies. And I think, therefore, also that the rogue development of tools of planetary modification, that means also field experiments are now being conducted without prior global political controls on ethical. I think it's not correct for a scientific research institution to develop tools, to develop planetary modification technologies, solar geoengineering technologies without any global political control. So I think if you ever wanted to positively engage in these debates, it has to start with governance, it has to start with a global prohibition. And then once the governance controls are there, then maybe the debate could at some point choose, then it's a democratic decision at the global level whether to go. But just developing right now these tools without any global regulatory system is just not correct. And for that reason, a couple of scientists got together to call for an end to the normalization of solar engineering, arguing that this is actually not a harmless scientific exercise. It's a very, very dangerous technology development. So I think, and many of my colleagues agree, and this is also a letter that we wrote in Nature at some point last year, that geoengineering should not be normalized. And this has led eventually to an international initiative of scientists, academics, to call for an international non-use agreement on solar geoengineering. So it's based on an open letter that has been published. It's available on our website, where we are calling for an international agreement that would have 5 major prohibitions that of course need to be then worked out by governmental delegations and other stakeholders. Number 1, we believe that governments, but also other actors, should not deploy technologies for solar engineering. They should prohibit the national funding agencies from supporting the development of technologies for solar engineering. That is not a prohibition of research, it's a prohibition of national funding agencies not to develop technologies for solar engineering. It's not a prohibition of climate research as it's sometimes being portrayed. It's about not to allow national funding agencies to have major research programs that are targeting the development of technologies for solar engineering. And then, of course, related to this, this would also include a ban on outdoor experiments of these technologies, the ban of patent rights, because you can't argue, I would believe, that anybody should ever have a patent right on a technology to modify the climate on planetary scale. I think this should never be patented. And then also these technologies should not be normalized in a variety of international institutions. So this is what we argue that governments should agree on. And this open letter has been signed by more than 370 signs so far, and we get more and more every day. It has been endorsed by a variety of civil society organizations. There's a website where, if you are interested, you can find more information on the initiative, but also supporting scientific research. We have the possibility for academics to sign the open letter, so it's framed as an academic initiative, but there's also the possibility for the endorsement of civil society organizations. And for those who are not academics or don't see themselves as academics, there's also a global petition where people can sign up and support this agreement also by means of a signature. So if there's any more information you would like to have, we have a Twitter account, we have a website, and I have also my personal internet and social media accounts. I'm happy also to engage in discussion on these issues. It is a controversial issue, but I think it's one of the most important discussions we have in climate policy, because I see a bifurcation in climate policies, either a future of massive reductions of emissions, or it is a future with high concentrations of carbon dioxide masked by programs on solar engineering at a planetary scale. I do not see happening, and I do not see being governable in any way that we would describe as just. So I'm very happy also that I was able to speak here in the Justice seminar series at IS, and looking forward to your comments. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Frank, for this very interesting talk. I see a round of applause here in the audience. So now I would like to present our commentator for your talk, which is Dr. Gabriel Dort. He is a postdoc in our Planetary Geopolitics and Geoengineering Research Group here at the ISS. His work is jointly funded by the ISS and the Harvard Science and Technology Studies program, and he does comparative work on distrust and skepticism in geoengineering, vaccines, and 5G. He has been following discussions around geoengineering for many years now. So, and after Gabriel's comment, I will open up for the debate. I already see that some people are raising their hands. So please, I ask for a bit more patience. So please, Gabriel, you're welcome to start with your comment.
Okay, sorry, I couldn't unmute myself. So my connection might be a little weak, so I would try with the camera and just wave if you hear me well. Thank you very much for this extremely rich and wide ranging talk. I think there's so much to discuss, and I will try to. I will start with an observation. I mean, I will try to, as much as possible, to frame this as questions, and then of course you're free to get on what you want to respond to or not. But this when you had this numbers about how many researchers involved in the global conversation on geoengineering, solar geoengineering, Germany was ranked third, I think, and part of the culprits of this is this group at the ISS, that it was for a long time a group mostly focusing on geoengineering and these families, but mostly on solar geoengineering. Now, scientific or climate scientific, ethical issues, governance. Now, this group we are in the process of framing our common questions, and one of those, so the group is called, as has been said, planetary geopolitics and solar geoengineering. But what we are trying to come up with as common questions is, what does it mean to when we talk of the planetary? What is this thing called planetary in these global issues, and how is it possible? How could we understand experimenting so it's small scale outdoor experiments that the solar geoengineering community have been advocating for a long time. What does it mean when you tinker with a global system?
Gabriel, sorry. Gabriel, sorry, your sound quality. Yeah, maybe you can switch off your video. Thanks.
I hope this will be better. So this slide with the modelization of the planet, with sort of the LEGO model of the planet on the left, and a view from the space of this planet, and then you turn to global governance, United Nations, and I was wondering to what extent on both sides I mean, United Nations, as you explain in detail, it's also a model of governance in the sense of choosing some relevant aspects, what has to be represented, and what has, and implicitly what cannot enter into this room, decision processes. So on the climate science and the governance mediations, in both cases, there are models, and so there are simplification of what's at stake, and a sort of semi-implicit agreement on what has to be discussed and what can be potentially discussed later, or what is not up for grab in these forums. So it's big. I mean, it's basically what we call in science and technology studies some sort of a co-productionist approach to look at how norms and values and politics are co-produced with epistemology, with understanding of the sort of natural world. I wanted to just push a little bit on these aspects to basically, it's part of the questions we ask in this group, and that I think it's extremely important, is to wonder to what extent solar geoengineering is not just a tool or sort of a marginal side effect of capitalism that gained traction in policy debates, but in itself inscribed in how we look at the planet and geopolitics today. And you showed this editorial in Nature, and it made me think, of course, of the Geology of Mankind editorial back in 2002, I think, by Paul Crutzen, when it was one of the first sort of global broad audience coining the term of the Anthropocene, but also in the very last paragraph, opening the question of maybe we will have to envision large-scale climate manipulation in this new era when humanity is considered as the main geological force. Right. So, to what extent is it? Because you use this word "tool" many times, and I don't want to push too hard, but it made me think that I think in many of these debates we tend to think of geoengineering as a technology that can be governed as such, but maybe it's worse than that, and it's more like a broader. It participates to a broader way to look at the climate and the planet as a whole, and that can be modeled, and then we can discuss about what enters the model and what doesn't. And on the sort of the other hand, I'm not very much an expert of justice, but it struck me for a long time how people like, for example, and I had this discussion with him very recently, even David Keyes, one of the main public figures of solar geoengineering, ambiguous but still sort of pushing for at least for more research, and he agreed with me on this. So there is a striking familiarity between how the controversy on solar geoengineering is framed and the GMO controversy, especially as if, again, it's a questioning comment, but as if the people who push for the at least more research and potential deployment of solar geoengineering had learned implicitly from the outcome of the GMO controversy, in which scientists were promoting research and the implementation of a new technology, tinkering with genes, with plants, with food, and activists opposing to this, saying no, we don't actually care about what you are doing in your labs. We are speaking of something else. We are speaking of food, of who produced the food we eat, where is it produced, who owns the patents, and how the distribution, of wealth and power is at stake in this sort of new way to look at food production. But in this case, it's less like global. It's more like horizontal, connecting aspects that, at first sight, are not part of the question. So, what does it mean to have to reduce emissions and to live in a warming and potentially devastated planet? doesn't, and then we go back to your representation of global powers. Doesn't mean the same thing for these global South countries, for example, and global North. So in terms of capacity to cope with and to adapt and stuff. So in both cases, questions, basically the question is how, what is, if you could maybe say more about how boundaries are drawn between what enters the state and what doesn't enter. And just one last small small point, when you call for no more publicly funded research on solar geoengineering, one of the big problems that is raised by some activists, to my understanding, and even the activists I'm studying personally that are charged of being conspirationists most of the time, the chemtrails community. One of these questions is like, especially the private funded and those people who fill in patents could benefit from. So in a way, pushing for more publicly funded research in that perspective would be good in a way, to just say, oh, so we have an open conversation rather than behind closed doors of companies that have something at stake. Does that make sense?
Great. Yes, of course. Thank you very much for the comment and some interesting ideas that you've raised. Now, I would also like to open for the debate, and of course, Frank will get an opportunity to answer to your comment. The first thing that I would like to ask is, since we started a bit later, if it would be possible maybe to extend our event like 10 minutes more. Would that be possible specifically for you, Frank Biermann?
Oh,
Yes?
absolutely.
Wonderful, because I think there will be a lively discussion to which I invite. I already see 2 hands raised. So we could now start with you answering to Gabriel's comment, or shall we take up to 1 or 2 more comments or questions from the audience first?
I am fine either way. Maybe I have a few. I mean, it was a very insightful comments from Gabriel. Thank you so much for a variety of points that you raised, and that I cannot all address now, of course, in a very short. Let me start with the Anthropocene that you mentioned at one point in your intervention. And this is what it is. I mean, this is what I discuss with my students. I mean, geoengineering, but also climate change as such. And carbon dioxide removal, all these issues together this is the Anthropocene. And these are discussions that people have to have. What is the future? How do we want to have the planet in 2050? And that is kind of the key discussion. And that means also that we have to revisit our institutions nationally and globally to deal with these kind of tremendous challenges. So this is a typical case of Anthropocene governance or Earth system governance, where different people have different opinions. I mean, that's of course clear. I mean, so some of the people who are on this calls also fundamentally disagree with me, because they also, the proponents, that disagree essentially with, I think everybody, with what value do you give to certain arguments? I mean, where's your optimism, where's your pessimism? I mean, are you an optimist regarding the governance, that somehow countries will figure it out? Or are you rather optimistic also regarding the emission scenarios? I mean, that's of course, I mean, if you do not want to have solar engineering, you have to somehow to reduce emissions drastically. And that is the conclusion of this project. And I believe that's possible. The IPCC argues it's possible. And I think we just need drastic policies to move forward with the reduction of emissions. So this is kind of all the Anthropocene story, which is very much related in a way also to GMOs. I mean, GMOs is also an Anthropocene discussion in a way, or an activity. where you also have different values and different risk perceptions of different countries. Actually, you see a certain transatlantic division, and I see the same division actually emerging when it comes to geoengineering, where you have some communities that are much more open and much more optimistic about the effectiveness, but also the governability of these technologies than others. So I think the GMO debate is very good an example of also of the solar geoengineering debate, because many of the questions are the same. In terms of boundaries, this is of course a huge fertile ground for STS researchers. And quite a few STS researchers have jumped on this issue for years already, and there are many books have been written and trying to understand these debates from an STS perspective. I mean, it just has to do also just with the terminology. I think there are at least 5 or 6 different terms that are being used for this solar geoengineering. I mean, I use the word solar geoengineering because this is, I would say, probably the most widely used term, but many others are being proposed, and they all have a political connotation. I mean, climate intervention or new climate technologies. And this is all, from an STS perspective, is a very fertile ground for analysis to study how these concepts are being developed, by what actors they are developed, what interests are behind there, and what are the political implications. Then there are also, I mean, some areas, for example, there is a discussion about local. You mentioned the planetary. There is a discussion about local solar radiation, for example, to protect the coral reefs in Australia. So this is kind of a different type of discussion, where I must say that our initiative has been agnostic about this particular programs that the Australians are running, where some people have different views on that. And one question is whether it's local. I mean, does local SRM actually exist, or is it always having a cross-regional impact? So these are debates that are also very important, where boundaries, as you mentioned, play a very important role. The side effect of capitalism is a very, there are lots of political economy scholars working on these issues. They look at the funding, and also to be very clear, right now, solar engineering is not funded largely by the oil companies. So it's not the main source of funding. So this is just an expectation, a fear that I have voiced for the future based on past experiences of the behavior of large corporations and large corporate actors in areas such as climate, for example, which were marked by denial, marked by obstruction. So I'm afraid that solar engineering will be the next frontier. But it's not the situation right now. And I believe, I mean, private funding has not been mentioned by me. So I believe that public funding will be key. I think the idea about Bill Gates single-handedly developing this, I think big philanthropic foundations have a major role to play. And right now there are various foundations behind the proponents. I mean, that's kind of all on their websites. So there are lots of rich philanthropic foundations in the United States that are funding research and also lobbying on solar geoengineering. But it's not yet the big corporate actors like oil and coal. This is just for the future. But definitely these activities have to be run by public actors, I would say. And therefore, the role is, I mean, the largest player right now will be national funding agencies, which is a DFG in Germany, the German Research Ministry, the same equivalents in other countries. So I would very much hope that the German actors will not fund research on the development of solar geoengineering. I mean, that's kind of my hope, that Germany will not go into this direction. It is quite obvious that the proponents want Germany to go into this direction. So it's kind of a conflict. And I think the role of Germany is actually very, very important, because the National Academy of Science in the United States has already spoken out in favor of more research. I'm not deployment, but just more research. And very important American universities, as Harvard, for example, are running programs on advocating for solar geoengineering research, and implicitly also potential deployment, I would say. But Germany is kind of a little bit sitting on the fence together with France also, for example. And so there's a question is, what are these countries, what positions are they eventually taking? And also, of course, the Global South. Anyway, so these are some of the comments. There's lots of more to be said. You raised so many interesting issues that I can't really respond to them all. because I see also my good friend Detlef Sprinz there also wants to join the discussion. Good.
Great, wonderful. Yeah, so just Detlef Sprinz already was the first person to raise the hand. So I would like to invite him to speak.
Okay. Thank you, Frank, for the very pointed, very well-structured presentation. I've much sympathy of where you're shooting for, but now let me play the devil's advocate and then make a positive offer, much in the vein of what you were interested in. What you proposed is in Manco Olson's terms, a privilege good. If you're rich enough and willing enough to wait enough, you can do it, because I look now at Wake Smith's data, it's 40 billion per year operation USD. And look at the CPRI data for military expenses. So the US has 800 billion per year in usage, China nearly 300, India 76, but maybe growing. So the point is, it's very few countries who can really operate such a system planetary style. There are smaller scale options, obviously, which are much cheaper. So having a global agreement is not really maybe what you need. Is you need the big players not to do it, but because they could do it. And if we look at nuclear proliferation, we have learned that those who don't want to be governed just are not part of the treaty. They exit or never select themselves in and just do what they want as long as they have money and patience. It's unfortunate. I don't say this is good. It's just an observation. And this could be very much happening here again. I'm not sure how you want to get around that, but maybe you have an idea. On the more optimistic side or positive side, my students have actually modeled the question whether the de facto moratorium on further developments will be, which I think is under the Convention on Biological Diversity. There is some sort of amendment which prohibits further experimentation, but you will know better than me. And my students, with the help of IAS some 5 or 6 years ago, did a prediction that there would be only a mild softening to some sort of, I guess, small scale field experiment, but nothing large scale. That was with the configuration of actors at the time and the negotiation situation. So we know the predictionist game actually worked rather well. The students did reasonably well, but we could use it if we have very good knowledge about where the actors stand and how we code them in a very structured way. We could actually try to give life to your idea of what are the prospects for a universal or not so universal agreement on this, and who would be in and who would be out, because everyone has the chance to exit, and there's also not the chance only to exit once you're in the once before the treaty you never sign, but every international treaty has an exit clause. So, and the US and the Russians have on weapons system have used it in the past. So it's very difficult to let, while I have sympathy what you do, and I'm happy to support it with modeling, I see the strategic issue is when it's inconvenient for whatever reasons, and whatever I think about it, countries can bail out later at reasonably small cost. That's it, but maybe you have an idea how to get around that.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. That were already several questions at once, but still I would like to invite one more comment by Kerstin Dörenbruch and also invite more people to raise their hands virtually to pick them afterwards.
Yes, Mr. Biermann, thank you so much for your presentation. I share your opinion because I've written my master's thesis about solar geoengineering, and I just want to add one new aspect because we wouldn't get a global consensus about geoengineering because some countries will be has got disadvantages. I share your idea that there will be single actors, but if they do it secretly, there will be more than one single actor. So, so maybe the effects will double or triple. That's my real fear. I've written my thriller about. So what do you say to this kind of risk?
Mhm.
Thank you very much. Yeah, now we come to a round of answers.
Good, good. I mean, starting very good comments. Thank you so much. Starting with Kerstin. I do not believe in secret deployment. I do not believe in secret research. I mean, I think that is a scale of activities. So if you look at the studies on this solar geoengineering that I mentioned, the stratospheric aerosol injection, you would need to have 100 up to 1,000 airplanes of a new type, most likely. I mean, airplanes that do not exist, they would have to be developed. This is possible. There are engineers who are already kind of developing some blueprints on how such airplanes should look like. But this is not possible secretly. So you can't develop a fleet of 100 or 1,000 airplanes. You can't develop them secretly, and you can't deploy them secretly, because they have to fly, of course. And of course, it's very easy to measure these kind of changes in the stratosphere. So I think secret deployment is not an option, and secret development starting at a certain level, I think it's also not a possibility. So it would rather be the development of a certain technology that countries could do in the open, and then other countries could object. This is the situation what you have, for example, with nuclear arms, that certain countries are developing the capacity and every other country is against it or so. So it's open, it's not secret, and then there is a conflict, there's a debate about whether this country should have the technology or not. And that leads me immediately to Detlef's points. Very good points. As you remember, Detlef is, of course, very much in this field of international negotiations. And we are discussing these issues on a broader scale, I think, since the 1990s. Number one is, I think the military capacity is not the right analog. I mean, the numbers that Detlef mentioned in the beginning, I think solar geoengineering can be on a much lower scale. So you don't necessarily need to have a huge military capacity unless you want to do it unilaterally, and there's kind of conflicts around it. Of course, that's something else. No? But we're talking about 100 to up 1,000 airplanes on a specific type. People talk about also balloons and others, but what most widely discussed is the deployment of novel types of airplanes. No? And then talking about, I mean, Detlef comes a bit from game theory and modeling. I do not believe that a universal agreement would be preferable, of course. I mean, the best would be a global agreement or not to go down this direction. And we have global agreements that are banning certain activities. So we are banning chemical weapons, we are banning nuclear tests. There is a ban on anti-personnel landmines, for example, that are largely universally accepted, even though there are some countries who do not accept them but comply. So there is a normative pressure in a way on these type of weapons in that case. And I would hope also for a non-use agreement that, even if it is not universal and not universally accepted, would develop a certain normative pressure by bringing together a large majority of countries, but also by a large majority of citizen organizations, civil society movements, and others, that would make the further investment in these technologies unplausible. That's kind of, so it's kind of not the game theoretic approach that Detlef takes, I think, could be countered here by just having the normative pressure of a large coalition of countries and other actors that would make it unlikely that these technologies are being further developed. Because essentially, I mean, everybody probably agrees that you would essentially, ideally, you would have a global support also for the deployment. You don't need it technically, but it's of course preferable for everybody. So I think a huge normative pressure could stop the normalization of the technologies as they are developed, as they could potentially be developed. And then the first point, I'm not sure I got this fully from Detlef, is that right now there is not that much investment in the technologies. So it is a very early state of development. And the question is whether countries are standing up against or standing up in favor of these technologies. I mean, this is kind of the big debate. And I believe once they are developed after a certain threshold, you don't get them back. And then they are there. I mean, once a certain threshold has reached in the develop, then you have a certain, these technically they call it the slippery slope argument. At some point, the debate will change, and at some point, it will be a normal part of the climate policy portfolio. And there's no way around. And then might enter also all sorts of cost-benefit analysis, and then it might become the dominant strategy for some actors. Not for everybody, but some actors will possibly, that's my fear, will possibly promote solar geoengineering as a dominant strategy for climate policy for some time, or one of the major strategies. No? It's not what the scientists want right now, but I'm not sure that, as I said, scientists cannot decide on the use of their products.
Great. So we have 2 more questions in the chat, and I think that probably they will be the last questions, because then after 10 more minutes we will finish our event. So first is Britt Kolditz.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you for this talk, and I like to add to follow up with Kerstin Dörenbruch. So I also thought that with normal common sense, I can easily follow your argumentation and say it appears really crazy or implausible, like you use the term, that such a planetary decision to change climate is even possible. So, but when you set it in relation to the current climate situation and the ecological situation, and you bring it in this urgency to act, then I think it's kind of naive to think that these legitimate ways and democratic ways are followed or have to be followed. I think you have to bring at. I thought in the same way, because I believe in the democratic ways, like you demonstrated. But we have an extreme situation, and it's a crisis. And in crisis, people are acting differently, even if they have to lead or have to save a planet or so on. And I think there can be the possibility that such legitimate ways are undermined in a way and overturned. I don't know in which ways, but it seems very possible. And I find it quite naive to believe in this ways like you do, in exclusively. So yeah, that's why I think it's the human reason is a kind of overestimated. So because human reason does not act in crisis in these ways. And even if we believe in science, and I believe in science, I can't imagine that people function even in the next decade with this climate situation will function in this way. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. One more question by Henrike Knappe.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks, Frank, for this really impressive and interesting presentation. I have a question, of course, related to justice and issues and the potential to find a just governance solution for this whole problem. I mean, you kind of outlined quite convincingly that the global institutions are unfit to react to this kind of threat of solar geoengineering, so to say. But what would be, or what do you see as a realistic solution to this in relation also to justice issues? So, for example, I thought when you talked about all this dynamics, that it might be more difficult to kind of give up power or the potential to gain even more power from the powerful actors, but it's might be a more realistic option to have those coalitions, for example, with countries in the global south and push really for this ban, so to say. So kind of more focus on those actors who might be threatened, who might be disprivileged by solar engineering, than to kind of hope that those who might have benefits from it to give up give this up, to give this privilege and so on. So I'm wondering how a just governance solution could look like, or how maybe one realistic way to go forward, and also how we could, this is maybe a more long-term question, how we could think of another global environmental governance system that could actually involve a democratic decision-making in this.
Mm-hmm. Good. Good. So they're very, very important points. Should I, or there's another hand, or?
Go ahead.
Good. So for the last point again, Henrique. I mean, the justice questions are for me fundamental in this matter, and they're not easy. I mean, there's also, coming back to Gabrielle's points, everybody in this debate, I mean, even the most, the strongest supporter, everybody talks about justice. So everybody uses the justice argument to argue the case either for or against geoengineering. So that makes it a very complicated terrain actually for ethicists. And it's clear, I mean, that the Global South, they have the high stakes in these matters, because they are most likely most affected. First of all, they are least responsible for climate change. That's kind of where it starts. They are most affected by climate change, should it develop further, and they also be most strongest affected by any harm in geoengineering. And they're not likely to be involved in decisions, as I pointed out in my talk. I mean, I use always the word implausible instead of impossible, because you could almost imagine some type of world government, which I do not believe that it will happen. But I think it's just implausible to believe that poor and relatively powerless countries in the Global South will have a say. That's different for China and India and Brazil, of course. So there are some developing countries, some Global South countries that are very powerful and that can play their own role. I mean, that's, of course, there's some ideas about China trying already developing these programs, or there are novels that argue that India would do it at some point. But the smaller developing countries, they are in a very difficult situation here. And I believe, coming also then, I think, to Britt's point, that geoengineering will not be a solution, but make it worse. It will make it worse because it will create an Anthropocene that in the middle of the century, we will have continuously high concentrations of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. And this will be combined with a more dominant strategy of solar geoengineering to mask the effects. And this will, I would say, only be plausible by an agreement about big powers in a sense. Actually, I don't really think that's plausible, anything possible. But I'm coming to the point of Brit, if I understand this, where the naivety is. So I think it's naive to believe that that there will be a global mechanism that is somewhat involves a large part of the world. I think many of the studies that are advocating solar engineering assume a small big power arrangement. I mean, that's actually what you find. There are even citations where people really say that only the big powers should have a decisive say. And this is, I mean, Detlef will be able to speak about this much better. This is typical a case of also veto power, that some bigger countries could just step out in a sense. So therefore you would have to create a system where big powers would be involved and have a bigger say than other countries. I mean, that's kind of what you find sometimes as a proposal. And I'm totally not accepting this. And then the question is emergency. Yeah, we have, of course, a difficult situation, there's no doubt. But the question is, how do we play out the emergency? I mean, what is the reaction that we as scientists, in my case, I mean, I don't know who's all in the audience here, but I'm a scientist. And there are two options. I can either go to politicians and decision makers and can say, hey guys, you have to go for solar geoengineering. Or I have to say, which I do say, is that we need a drastic reduction of emissions. And this is what the IPCC says. I mean, the IPCC in the last report of Working Group 3, they have a summary for policymakers. They do not mention solar geoengineering with one word. So the IPCC has made it very clear that right now, SRM, solar geoengineering, is not part of what they are discussing with policymakers. It's not part of the policymaker summary. And I think that's very important also to see it this way. So this is the majority position in the scientific community. Those who are calling for SRM development are a minority. And I think that needs to be seen also this way. But then, of course, in terms of emergency, we have to drastically reduce our emissions. And that is kind of where the emergency comes in. And this is, I think, what we as scientists have to much stronger actually mention. So I believe that was mentioned in the beginning by Louis. I mean, the scholarly activism, we have to get out of the ivory towers. I mean, I think IS is actually, this is transdisciplinary focus, one of the stronger players. So I think there's no doubt that IS is one of the leaders there, but it has to be supported. More is needed to really have the transition processes and transformation processes that are needed that really start them now. And I'm also quite optimistic in a sense that this will be possible, as the IPCC is.
Great. This sounds like very wonderful final remark. Although, of course, I guess, I don't know how many people in the audience now leave with more questions than answers, because I think this is an ongoing, very relevant debate. So thank you very much for all your contributions. And yes, this is part of a lecture series. So we have had already 8 lectures this year. You can all find them in our YouTube channel. And the next lecture, we will not have a lecture this October, but we will be back again in November. So you can stay updated through our newsletter, and you're all welcome to go on participating. And we hope to keep in a very close discussion also about those relevant topics. So thank you very much to everyone.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Stay in touch.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.